If housing prices crash, landlords collapse, and tenants, they face the most dangerous housing experiment in US history. That is not a line meant to shock you. It is a reality already taking shape in cities across America. Everyone talks about the housing bubble, the mortgage crisis, the Wall Street speculation, but very few ask the one question that cuts deeper than all of that. What happens to the tenants? The millions of people who don't own a home, who don't profit when prices go up, and who don't have equity to lose when they collapse. Tenants live inside this machine, month after month, paycheck after paycheck, and when the system falters, they are the first to feel the cracks beneath their feet. Imagine this: a family in Queens paying $2,400 a month for a two-bedroom apartment. The landlord is leveraged to the bone, using tenant rent to cover an oversized mortgage taken out during the peak of the market. Then the market turns. Suddenly, that building is underwater. The landlord stops maintaining the property. Repairs are delayed, garbage piles up, heating fails in winter. At first, the family thinks, well, at least our rent won't rise. But then comes the knock on the door. The bank has foreclosed. The landlord vanishes. And the tenants? They're left inside a limbo where no one knows who truly controls the building. Rent checks bounce back, eviction notices appear, and the city is overwhelmed by thousands of identical cases happening all at once. This is not a hypothetical. It happened in 2008 across the Midwest, in New York, in California. Tenants were suddenly living in abandoned homes, in apartment blocks owned by banks that didn't even want them, because banks aren't in the business of being landlords. And as history threatens to repeat itself, the new collapse may cut even deeper. The reason is simple. The tenant population has grown larger, more fragile, and more dependent than ever. More Americans rent today than at any time since the 1960s. A generation priced out of home ownership, trapped by rising mortgage rates, student debt, and wages that simply don't keep pace. For many, renting isn't a temporary stage, it's permanent. So when rents collapse, when landlords default, when buildings empty out, the shock doesn't just hit a handful of unlucky families, it hits an entire class, an entire economy built on the fragile balance of monthly rent payments. But here's the paradox. A collapse in housing prices doesn't automatically mean relief for tenants. Many assume that if property values fall, rents should too. After all, lower costs for landlords should trickle down to renters, right? But the history of housing collapses tells a very different story. Landlords under financial stress often don't cut rent. They raise it, trying to squeeze every possible dollar from tenants to cover debt. Others abandon their properties entirely, letting them slide into disrepair until conditions become unlivable. And in some cases, opportunistic investors swoop in, buying up entire neighborhoods of foreclosed buildings, converting them into luxury rentals or short-term vacation units, pricing tenants even further out of their own communities. So the so-called rent collapse isn't always about rents falling. It's about the collapse of security, of stability, of the promise that if you pay your rent on time, you'll have a place to live. It is about tenants waking up to realize the contract they thought they signed. The idea that rent buys you stability was always fragile. Consider Detroit after the crash of 2008. Thousands of renters found themselves suddenly in foreclosed homes. They had been paying their rent faithfully, but their landlords hadn't been paying their mortgages. Overnight, tenants became illegal squatters in homes they thought were secure. Eviction notices came not because they failed to pay rent, but because the financial system above them collapsed. Tenants learned the hard truth. You can play by the rules and still lose your home. Now scale that to New York City, Los Angeles, Miami, markets where rents are already at historic highs, where landlords are more indebted than ever, and where the margin for error is razor thin. If interest rates remain high and property values decline, the first shockwaves will be felt in rental markets. Landlords unable to refinance, buildings falling into distress, and behind every spreadsheet of losses sits a tenant, a family, a person about to be uprooted. The collapse isn't just financial, it's physical. When landlords can't afford upkeep, buildings start to rot. Broken elevators in high-rises, roof leaks ignored for months, infestations spreading unchecked. For tenants, a rent collapse often looks like mold spreading across walls, trash left uncollected, doors without locks. And when the city steps in with subsidies, rent freezes, or emergency repair programs, it often comes too little, too late. Subsidies may keep a family from immediate eviction, but they rarely stop the decay of the buildings themselves. In fact, subsidies can create a perverse incentive, landlords collecting government checks while leaving tenants trapped in slums. This is the dangerous housing experiment America is already walking into. An experiment where the tenant becomes a pawn between collapsing landlords, predatory investors, and overstretched governments. In some cities, the result is mass displacement, tenants forced into shelters, doubling up with relatives, or leaving the city altogether. In others, it creates a shadow world of informal housing, cash rents, illegal basements, and overcrowded apartments where tenants have no legal protection at all. And yet, the most dangerous part of this experiment isn't inside any single city. It's the way the collapse spreads, because rental markets are deeply interconnected. If a collapse destabilizes New York, it pressures landlords in New Jersey, in Boston, in Chicago. If Los Angeles collapses, it ripples through the West Coast, into Phoenix, into Seattle. And the American housing market doesn't exist in isolation. Global investors, sovereign wealth funds, and international private equity have poured billions into U.S. rental housing. When the system buckles, the shock doesn't stop at the Hudson River or the Pacific coastline. It ricochets across continents. Already, European pension funds own pieces of American apartment complexes. Asian banks have lent to U.S. developers. Canadian corporations run rental management firms across the Midwest. If those pipelines of rent money falter, if tenants stop paying, if buildings fail, the losses show up on balance sheets from Frankfurt to Toronto to Tokyo. The collapse of the tenant economy in America becomes a global contagion. And it's not just about numbers. Housing is the most human of all economic systems. When tenants are displaced, entire communities unravel. Schools lose students. Local businesses lose customers. Crime rises in abandoned buildings. Cities lose tax revenue as property values collapse, forcing budget cuts that further reduce services for the very tenants most at risk. A rent collapse isn't just an economic event, it's a social one, with ripple effects that can destabilize entire societies. For now, the surface looks calm, rents remain high, vacancies low, but beneath, the cracks are already forming. Tenants are burdened with record levels of rent-to-income ratios. Landlords face mounting debt as refinancing windows close. And cities juggle impossible math, trying to subsidize tenants without bankrupting their own budgets. The question is not whether the system can bend. It already is. The question is when it breaks. And when it does, tenants will find themselves at the center of the storm. Because this isn't just about economics, it's about trust. Trust that if you pay your rent, you deserve a stable home. Trust that the government will protect tenants when landlords fail. Trust that cities won't abandon neighborhoods to rot. That trust is eroding, one eviction notice at a time. And as we peel back the layers of this collapse, remember this: it won't stay confined to one country. Housing is global. The crisis of tenants in New York becomes the crisis of banks in London, the crisis of pensions in Canada, the crisis of housing markets in Asia. And in the end, the collapse that begins with tenants in America spreads far beyond its borders. And this collapse won't stay in America. It spreads worldwide. The collapse of rents doesn't always look like numbers flashing red on a screen. It often looks like silence, hallways without maintenance staff, tenants waiting weeks for a simple repair call that never comes. It looks like notices taped to doors, telling families they have 30 days to vacate, not because they did anything wrong, but because the building they live in has been swallowed whole by debt. And it looks like an entire generation waking up to the realization that renting is no longer a temporary bridge to stability, but a permanent condition of uncertainty. In a housing collapse, tenants don't just face higher risk of eviction. They face the erosion of the very idea of a home as a place of stability. In many American cities, the tenant is trapped between three failing systems: landlords burdened with debt, governments burdened with political paralysis, and financial markets that view homes not as shelter, but as an asset class. When those three systems collide, the tenant becomes collateral damage. Take the story of Chicago in the aftermath of 2008. The city was filled with buildings where tenants kept paying rent long after their landlords had walked away. Banks foreclosed, but they didn't want to own the properties. They didn't maintain them. They didn't provide security. In some cases, entire blocks of apartments sat in legal limbo, neither landlord nor bank taking responsibility. Tenants lived surrounded by abandoned units, in buildings where lights went dark, hallways grew dangerous, and the only people knocking on their doors were city inspectors, threatening fines or eviction. What began as a mortgage crisis became a tenant crisis, one that reshaped the city's landscape for more than a decade. Fast forward to today, and the stakes are even higher. The size of the rental market has grown. The scale of Wall Street's involvement has grown, and the reliance of city governments on rent as a tax base has grown. When a single landlord defaults on a building, it's a tragedy for the tenants inside. But when dozens or hundreds default at once, it's a catastrophe that cities cannot contain. Eviction courts overflow, shelters run out of space, families scatter. And every failure erodes the thin layer of trust between citizens and the system that promises them protection. Now think of the paradox again. Many assume that falling home prices should make life easier for renters. But in reality, the collapse often creates a vacuum that sucks tenants into even more precarious positions. When landlords default, investors move in. Private equity firms, hedge funds, global asset managers, they swoop into distressed markets like vultures, buying up properties at fire sale prices. And what do they do with them? Rarely lower rents. Instead, they restructure, they renovate selectively, they remarket buildings as luxury spaces, pushing out long-time tenants, raising rents under the cover of upgrades, and turning working-class housing into something unrecognizable. This is the cycle tenants face. Collapse doesn't mean relief. It means displacement. Lower prices don't mean lower rents. They mean ownership consolidates into fewer, larger, and more ruthless hands. And while this plays out on the ground, another layer of crisis unfolds: the social cost of displacement. When tenants are uprooted, the shock doesn't end at their door. Children lose stability in schools. Local shops lose their steady customers. Churches, community centers, neighborhood associations all lose the very people who sustain them. And what replaces them is often transients, tenants doubling up in overcrowded apartments, families moving city to city in search of affordability, communities fractured into fragments that never quite reassemble. There's also the invisible cost: health. Studies show that tenants facing eviction experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, even physical illness. Children in unstable housing situations perform worse academically, are more likely to miss school, and are more vulnerable to long-term poverty. A rent collapse isn't just about broken buildings, it's about broken lives. The financial crisis trickles down into the bloodstream of society. And yet, even as this crisis grows, governments are often powerless to stop it. They try subsidies, rental vouchers, emergency relief checks, temporary eviction bans. These measures can buy time, but they rarely fix the underlying problem. Subsidies may protect one tenant from immediate eviction, but they also pour billions into the pockets of landlords who continue to neglect properties. It's a bandage on a wound that never heals. Worse, subsidies can create an illusion of stability, delaying the collapse rather than preventing it. Tenants think they're safe until the moment the funding dries up and the ground vanishes beneath them. There's also a cruel irony in eviction bans. During the pandemic, many cities froze evictions, keeping tenants in place while landlords went unpaid. At first, it looked like protection, but in reality, it created a backlog of unpaid rent and building debt that landlords carried forward. When the bans lifted, tenants faced eviction not just for 1 month of unpaid rent, but for 12 or 18. And landlords, already struggling under debt, had even less incentive to keep their properties livable. The result? More disrepair, more foreclosures, more investors waiting in the shadows to buy up the wreckage. This is where the collapse becomes most visible, the abandoned building. Walk through parts of Cleveland or St. Louis, and you'll see entire rows of structures that once housed families now boarded up, windows shattered, weeds growing through cracked foundations. Inside cities like Los Angeles, you'll see tent encampments forming just blocks away from vacant apartment complexes, homes sitting empty not because people don't need them, but because the financial system that controls them would rather keep them off the market than lower the rent. To a tenant, that's the cruelest cut of all. Homes exist, demand exists, but the collapse makes them unreachable, locked away behind financial calculations that value profit above shelter. And this problem isn't uniquely American. Look at Spain after its housing crisis, when thousands of apartments sat empty even as families were evicted. Or Ireland, where foreign investors scooped up entire blocks of homes and held them for speculative gain. Or China, where ghost cities of empty towers rise over a population struggling with affordability. The rent collapse, once it begins, takes different forms in different countries, but the underlying story is the same. Tenants pay the highest price. So what does this mean for the future? It means that the most vulnerable in society, the renters living paycheck to paycheck, are positioned at the edge of a cliff. They are the canaries in the coal mine. Their struggles signal a deeper unraveling of the housing system, because if tenants can't remain housed, cities can't remain stable. And if cities collapse, the national economy follows. It is the tenant, not the landlord, who holds the fragile thread that ties this system together. Imagine again that family in Queens. They've been paying rent on time, month after month, trusting that this simple act secures their shelter. Now their landlord defaults, the bank seizes the building, an investment firm buys it at auction. Suddenly their rent rises by 25%. They can't afford it. They're forced out. Their children must change schools. The mother commutes longer to her job. The father picks up a second shift. The strain tears at the family. Multiply that story by thousands across every city, and you begin to see the true cost of collapse. And as America stands on the edge of its next housing downturn, this is the question we must confront. Not just what happens to landlords or to banks or to Wall Street, but what happens to tenants. Because tenants are not statistics. They are the backbone of every neighborhood, every school, every city block. When their stability is destroyed, everything built upon it begins to shake. That's the heart of this crisis. Not numbers, but people. Not assets, but lives. And unless the system changes, the next great rent collapse will not simply reduce prices. It will unravel the fabric of society itself. And this unraveling, like every collapse before it, won't remain confined within US borders, because once again the same investors who own American apartments own housing in Berlin, in Toronto, in Sydney. Once rents collapse in America, the ripple flows outward, destabilizing rental markets everywhere. Just as the mortgage collapse of 2008 spread worldwide, so too will the tenant collapse of today. Because when tenants fall, cities fall. And when cities fall, nations tremble, and this collapse is already spreading. The collapse always starts quietly. First, it's a missed repair, a broken intercom that never gets fixed. Then, it's the hallway lights that flicker for weeks. The landlord doesn't answer calls as quickly. The management office cuts hours. Small signs, but they build up until tenants realize they're living inside a system already collapsing, piece by piece. By the time eviction notices arrive, the collapse is no longer abstract. It's on the doorstep. For tenants, the collapse isn't about Wall Street losses or falling housing indexes. It's about survival. What happens when the building you've lived in for years stops being safe? When you wake up to find that your rent check doesn't secure heat in the winter or running water in the summer? That's the human face of the rent collapse. It turns homes into temporary shelters, leases into illusions, and communities into ghost towns. One of the clearest examples came from Minneapolis during the last housing crash. Entire apartment blocks, once filled with working-class tenants, fell into foreclosure. Banks didn't want them, landlords couldn't hold them, and tenants were trapped inside units that were technically still occupied, but no longer supported. Police calls rose. Fires started in abandoned units. Tenants who stayed found themselves surrounded by emptiness, as if the city had given up on their streets. It was a collapse that felt not just financial, but existential. What does it mean to live in a home that no one claims responsibility for? That's the reality many renters are already facing today, and it spreads beyond buildings. When a tenant loses their home, the burden doesn't vanish, it shifts. It moves into public housing systems already stretched to the limit. It moves into homeless shelters overflowing with families who never imagined they'd be there. It moves into hospitals treating illnesses linked to stress and poor living conditions. It moves into schools struggling with children who cycle through classrooms as their families hop from one temporary address to another. The collapse is contagious. One eviction multiplies into 10 problems across the city, and when thousands happen at once, the system buckles. But let's look deeper at why tenants are so exposed. The modern rental market has become a trap designed around leverage. Landlords don't just own property, they borrow against it. They refinance. They treat rent as a cash flow to service loans, not as a social contract with tenants. And when financing dries up, the whole system collapses like a house of cards. Tenants, who played no role in these financial games, are crushed in the fallout. They pay rent faithfully, yet they're told the building is bankrupt. They followed the rules, yet they're evicted. It's a cruel system, one that punishes stability instead of rewarding it. And this is where government intervention often fails. Cities try to impose rent control, hoping to shield tenants from sudden spikes. But when landlords collapse, rent control doesn't fix the core problem. It just accelerates abandonment. Landlords walk away because capped rents can't cover their debts. Others respond by slashing maintenance. The unintended effect: tenants may keep their apartments temporarily, but the quality of life deteriorates so fast that they're forced out anyway. Rent control becomes less a shield than a slow bleed. Subsidies are no silver bullet either. Housing vouchers may help one tenant pay rent, but they also inflate demand in markets where supply is shrinking. Worse, they funnel public money into private landlords, rewarding speculative ownership instead of discouraging it. And once subsidies run dry, tenants face the cliff again, only this time the fall is even steeper. What makes this collapse different from past crises is its scale and timing. More people rent now than during the last great housing downturn. More landlords are tied to global financial markets, and more governments are already stretched thin from years of deficit spending. That means the cushion is gone. There's no slack in the system. When the next collapse hits, tenants won't just face temporary hardship, they'll face systemic failure. And here's the brutal truth. Many cities are already in collapse without naming it. Look at Los Angeles, where encampments line sidewalks while thousands of apartments sit empty because owners hold out for higher rents. Look at New York, where warehousing has become common practice, landlords keeping units off the market entirely, betting that prices will rebound. For tenants, this is collapse by another name. Homes exist, yet they remain unreachable. Families live on the edge of the street, while vacant apartments loom above them. It's not just inefficiency, it's dysfunction at the core of the housing system. To understand how dangerous this is, we have to recognize the unique vulnerability of renters. Homeowners, when their mortgage fails, may lose equity and face foreclosure. But tenants, when landlords fail, lose everything instantly. There is no buffer, no asset to fall back on, no protection beyond a fragile lease that can be shredded in a courtroom in minutes. That's why every collapse, no matter how it begins, ends with tenants bearing the brunt. And while governments debate policy fixes, the collapse doesn't wait. Eviction courts in cities like Houston and Atlanta are already seeing surges in cases. Judges sign orders by the dozen, sometimes without tenants even present. Families walk out with a few days' notice, nowhere to go, no plan for tomorrow. It's not a slow-motion crisis, it's a rolling thunder already here. Consider the downstream effects on crime and safety. Abandoned buildings don't sit idle, they become magnets. Squatters move in, fires break out, criminal networks exploit empty spaces. Neighbors who remain feel unsafe, even if they keep paying rent. Tenants become prisoners in their own homes, trapped by forces far beyond their control. This isn't just about economics, it is about what happens to the social order when shelter becomes unstable. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine paying more than half your income in rent, only to be told you have to leave anyway. Imagine your children asking if you'll still be in the same home next month and not being able to answer. Imagine carrying that uncertainty not for weeks, but for years. This is the reality millions of tenants now live in, a grinding anxiety that eats away at stability, productivity, even hope. The rent collapse isn't just stripping away housing, it's stripping away the future. But what happens when the collapse reaches critical mass? When the number of displaced tenants grows so large that entire cities are reshaped? The answer is already visible in places like San Francisco, where high rents and repeated displacement hollowed out middle-class neighborhoods. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, many of them can't afford to live in the cities they serve. That hollowing out is collapse in slow motion. A city that can't house its workers can't function. And when collapse accelerates, it doesn't just force out the poor, it climbs the income ladder. Professionals, families, even retirees with savings find themselves pushed into instability. Collapse doesn't discriminate once it gathers momentum. And yet, behind all this, there is profit. For some, collapse is opportunity. Investment firms are already raising billions in distressed real estate funds, preparing to scoop up rental properties as landlords default. They'll buy cheap, renovate selectively, and reintroduce units at luxury prices. The tenant who once lived there will be priced out, replaced by someone wealthier, or by a short-term rental listing that yields more in a week than a tenant could pay in a month. The cycle repeats: collapse for tenants, consolidation for investors. That's the pattern history shows us. After the crash of 2008, firms like Blackstone became some of the largest landlords in America, acquiring foreclosed homes by the thousands. Today, those same firms are positioning themselves for the next wave. And tenants? They'll face the same fate as before: displacement, uncertainty, and a system that treats them not as people, but as revenue streams. This is why the rent collapse is so dangerous. It is not just the loss of housing, it is the reconfiguration of society. When investors own more of the rental stock, when governments subsidize failing systems instead of rebuilding them, when tenants are treated as interchangeable units, housing stops being a social foundation. It becomes a speculative commodity, detached from the human need for shelter. And once that happens, collapse isn't a risk, it's the default state. So what happens next? Tenants will adapt, as they always do. Some will move further out, commuting longer hours just to afford shelter. Others will double up, squeezing multiple families into apartments designed for one. Still others will join the swelling ranks of the unhoused, building informal communities under bridges and in vacant lots. This is how collapse reshapes the landscape, not in sudden destruction, but in gradual substitution. Formal housing gives way to informal survival. Legal leases give way to handshakes and cash. Stability gives way to transience. And this story, unfolding in city after city, won't stay local. The world is watching because the American rental market is a cornerstone of global finance. When it cracks, it doesn't just scatter dust, it sends shockwaves. Investors in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East all hold stakes in US housing. Pension funds, sovereign wealth, private equity, they all rely on rent checks flowing each month. When those checks stop, the tremors spread worldwide. The collapse of a tenant in Queens becomes the collapse of a balance sheet in Frankfurt, a pension fund in Toronto, an investment portfolio in Singapore. And that is why the tenant is not just a renter, but a linchpin in the global system. Their rent doesn't just keep a roof overhead, it keeps financial markets stable, which means when the tenant collapses, everything else begins to collapse with them. And this collapse is still unfolding. When collapse reaches a breaking point, the story no longer belongs to individual tenants. It becomes a story about cities themselves. Cities, after all, are built on the foundation of rent. Every tax base, every public service, every bus route and police patrol relies on the assumption that tenants will keep paying. When they stop or when they're displaced, the city begins to unravel from the inside. Think of Detroit after its housing crisis. Entire neighborhoods emptied almost overnight, leaving behind block after block of abandoned homes and apartments. City services shrank, schools closed, streetlights went dark because the tax revenue wasn't there to pay the bills. For tenants who stayed, life became harder with each passing year. Grocery stores closed because customers had vanished, hospitals downsized, jobs disappeared. What started as a housing collapse rippled outward into a civic collapse, hollowing out the very idea of a functioning city. And now, major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago stand on that same edge. They are far larger, far wealthier than Detroit, but the dynamic is the same. Once tenants fall, everything else begins to buckle. A landlord's bankruptcy might seem like a private misfortune, but when multiplied across thousands of properties, it becomes a public disaster. The chain is simple. Tenants lose homes, cities lose tax revenue, services shrink, and the cycle feeds back on itself. For tenants, this creates a paradoxical nightmare. They may scrape and sacrifice to keep paying rent, but they're paying into a system that no longer provides what it once promised. They pay rent, yet their building deteriorates. They pay rent, yet their schools close. They pay rent, yet their neighborhood becomes more dangerous. The collapse hollows out the meaning of rent itself, turning it from a guarantee of stability into a desperate attempt to hold on to something already slipping away. This civic hollowing also changes the map of cities. Rent collapse doesn't affect every neighborhood equally. Affluent districts with strong investor interest often recover quickly, snapped up and redeveloped. But working-class neighborhoods, where profit margins are thinner, are left to decay. The result is a new geography of inequality. Glittering towers rise in city centers, while just blocks away entire streets are left in semi-abandonment. For tenants, this split becomes a visible reminder of the system's cruelty. Homes exist, wealth exists, but not for them. And this creates a deeper social fracture, resentment. Tenants see buildings stand empty while they sleep in cars. They watch government subsidize luxury development while their own subsidies run out. They see landlords walk away from debts with financial settlements, while a tenant behind on rent faces eviction with no safety net. The sense of injustice grows, and when enough people feel that the system is rigged against them, anger spills out into protest. We saw hints of this in Berlin, when tenants rallied against rising rents and pushed for expropriation of corporate landlords. We saw it in Barcelona, where activists occupied empty homes owned by banks. Collapse doesn't just produce homelessness, it produces resistance. And yet resistance faces a powerful opponent, global capital. The modern housing market is not local anymore. Tenants may live in a neighborhood, but their landlord may be an LLC owned by a hedge fund based in another state, which in turn is financed by a pension fund in another country. When tenants stop paying rent, the financial repercussions move upward through a chain of ownership so complex that it barely seems real. But for the tenant, it's very real. Their eviction notice may carry the name of a local property manager, but the true landlord may be a global investment firm. How do you resist an opponent that doesn't even live in the same world as you? This is where the collapse exposes the greatest danger, the detachment of ownership from responsibility. Investors can afford to wait out collapses. They can leave buildings vacant, write off losses, and wait for markets to recover. Tenants can't. They need shelter today, this month, this year. The collapse creates an asymmetry. Capital has patience, tenants don't. And patience in the end wins, which means collapse rarely punishes those who created it. It punishes those trapped inside it. But there's a bigger question still. What happens when millions of tenants worldwide experience collapse at once? The housing market is now global. Rent crises in New York echo in London, in Toronto, in Sydney. Financial firms move money between them, exploiting collapses here to profit there. A collapse in American rents could trigger a reallocation of capital away from Europe or Asia, destabilizing their rental markets in turn. The system is interconnected, and tenants everywhere are caught in the web. Consider the global nature of subsidies. Governments from Canada to Germany to Japan have experimented with rent relief, tax credits, or direct payments to tenants. But subsidies are not infinite. They rely on budgets, and budgets rely on growth. When the global economy slows, as it does in the wake of housing collapse, governments face hard choices. Do they fund rent relief or healthcare? Do they pay landlords or teachers? Tenants are left vulnerable to political winds, their shelter tied not just to local conditions, but to global economic trends far beyond their control. And so collapse spreads, not just through markets, but through politics. Rising rents and tenant displacement fuel populist anger, reshape elections, and destabilize governments. Look at Spain's political landscape after its housing crash. Look at Ireland, where housing became the defining issue of national debate. The same patterns are emerging now in the US, where tenant movements are no longer fringe, they're mainstream. Collapse forces housing onto the political stage, whether governments are ready or not. For tenants, though, politics is a slow-moving machine. Their reality is immediate. Eviction notices don't wait for elections. Abandoned buildings don't pause for debates in Congress. The collapse moves faster than politics can respond. And that speed gap is what makes the tenant crisis so devastating. By the time policies are crafted, passed, and implemented, thousands of tenants may already be gone, scattered across shelters, relatives' couches, or the streets. Collapse is always faster than reform. But here's the darker truth. In many places, collapse is not an accident. It's a strategy. Some landlords intentionally let buildings decay, knowing they can later sell to investors at a profit. Some investors allow vacancies to rise, waiting for neighborhoods to clear out before redeveloping. In this sense, collapse becomes a tool of transformation. The suffering of tenants is not collateral damage, it's part of the plan. They are pushed out, making way for new, wealthier tenants, or for conversions into commercial properties, or for redevelopment into luxury condos. Collapse is, for some, simply another form of urban renewal. For tenants, this realization is devastating. They're not just victims of mismanagement, they're victims of design. The collapse they experience is the result of deliberate choices made in boardrooms, investment prospectuses, and city planning meetings. And when you realize that your suffering is someone else's strategy, the sense of powerlessness deepens. And yet in every collapse, there are moments of resistance that shine through. Tenants forming unions, rent strikes, occupations of abandoned buildings, community land trusts buying properties to keep them permanently affordable. These efforts are small compared to the scale of global capital, but they represent seeds of a different vision. Housing not as a commodity, but as a human right. Collapse creates destruction, but it also creates openings for new ideas. The question is whether those ideas can grow fast enough to challenge the scale of the crisis. Because as collapse deepens, tenants don't just lose housing, they lose time. Time to organize, time to resist, time to build alternatives. And capital knows this. That's why the cycle repeats. Collapse, consolidation, gentrification, displacement, again and again, city after city. And this time, the cycle is global. From Los Angeles to London, from Berlin to Beijing, the great rent collapse is not an isolated event. It's a worldwide transformation of housing into a speculative game. And the players in that game are not tenants. They're the chips being moved across the table. And as with every collapse, the ripples will not stop at borders. America's rent crisis will not remain in America. It will spread through the veins of global finance, through the strategies of investors, through the politics of housing everywhere, because collapse, once unleashed, does not respect boundaries. And this collapse is not just beginning, it is accelerating. The final act of the great rent collapse is not measured simply in evictions, bankruptcies, or boarded-up buildings. It is measured in the slow unraveling of trust between people and the systems that promise them stability. For decades, tenants believed that if they worked hard, paid their rent on time, and respected the rules, they could secure a roof over their heads. Landlords believed that real estate was the safest investment in the world, a steady stream of income immune to volatility. Governments believed that subsidies and regulations could hold the center together. But when the collapse begins, all three illusions are tested at once, and the cracks become visible in every neighborhood. What begins with missed rent checks becomes a cascade of human decisions. Some landlords, unable to cover their mortgages, cut corners on maintenance until buildings are unsafe. Elevators stop working, heating systems fail, and infestations spread. Other landlords, desperate to hold on to paying tenants, slash rents to survive, creating a strange paradox where some tenants win temporary relief, while others lose everything in forced evictions. Tenants, once passive actors in the system, now face impossible choices. Do they stay in a crumbling unit, or do they join the ranks of the displaced? The human toll is written in stories of families pushed from apartments they lived in for decades, children forced to change schools mid-year, elderly tenants facing homelessness after a lifetime of stability, eviction courts overflow, homeless shelters expand beyond capacity, tents rise in city parks, not just as symbols of poverty, but as markers of a society overwhelmed. The government tries to respond: emergency rent relief, short-term freezes on evictions, rushed construction of temporary housing. But these interventions arrive late, too fragmented, and often too small to change the course of events. Meanwhile, abandoned properties multiply. In once thriving neighborhoods, apartment towers sit half-empty, attracting squatters and crime. The absence of tenants means less revenue for city governments, which rely on property taxes to fund services. Police, sanitation, and schools all suffer cutbacks. A vicious cycle emerges. Fewer services make neighborhoods less livable, driving more tenants out, further eroding the tax base. The collapse doesn't remain confined to renters or landlords. It spreads into the entire urban ecosystem. Financial markets, too, recoil. Pension funds that invested in rental-backed securities suddenly face losses, cutting into retirement savings. Banks that finance landlords face mounting defaults. The collapse becomes not just a housing crisis, but a systemic financial risk. This is why the analogy to 2008 is unavoidable. Just as bad mortgages triggered a global meltdown, failing rents can shake the foundations of economies built on real estate. But the most dangerous experiment of all is social. When millions of tenants realize that their housing security depends not on fairness, but on the fragile solvency of landlords and the political will of governments, faith in the system fractures. Tenants organize, forming unions, staging rent strikes, demanding ownership of their buildings. In some cities, the government seizes failing properties and converts them into public housing, igniting debates about socialism versus private enterprise. In others, tech firms and private equity swoop in, buying distressed housing stock at pennies on the dollar, concentrating ownership into fewer hands than ever before. This is the fork in the road. One path leads to collective solutions. Housing cooperatives, stronger tenant protections, public investment in affordable housing. The other path leads to deeper inequality. Corporate landlords, digital rent extraction systems, and a generation of tenants locked into permanent precarity. The outcome will differ city by city, but the struggle will be universal. And this collapse won't stay in America. Housing markets are globalized. Investors in Hong Kong own apartments in Los Angeles. Canadian pension funds finance New York high-rises. European banks hold securities tied to American rents. When tenants in U.S. cities default, the ripple reaches London, Berlin, São Paulo, and beyond. Already, cities around the world face similar pressures: unaffordable rents, speculative bubbles, and fragile tenant protections. The American experiment becomes the world's warning. The question now is not whether tenants will suffer. The evidence is clear they will, but whether societies can learn from the collapse. Can governments build resilient housing systems before the next crisis? Can tenants gain real power in markets stacked against them? Or will the collapse mark the beginning of a new era, one where shelter itself becomes unstable, a privilege rather than a right? The Great Rent Collapse forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When the housing system fails, it does not fail landlords first. It fails tenants, the millions of people who cannot simply walk away from a mortgage or write off a bad investment. It fails families who depend on a stable home for every other part of their lives: work, education, safety. And when it fails tenants, it destabilizes everything else: neighborhoods, cities, and even nations. This is what makes the collapse the most dangerous housing experiment in U.S. history. And unless the lessons are learned quickly, the next great housing collapse won't stop at America's borders. It will spread worldwide.